How many times has a Christian told you that they would pray for you? I'll pray for you to get that job. I'll pray for you to pass that test. I'll pray for your financial struggles. I'll pray for your help. This is a very common thing that we experience in our society, especially within, Christian society. People are always praying for one another and praying for health and praying for good things, praying for sports teams. But my question is, how in a Christian worldview can prayer work? They say prayer works. You just got to pray because prayer really works. But how? How can prayer work within the Christian worldview? And that's what I want to explore today. Is prayer something that you do to change God's mind or to get God to do something he wouldn't have already done? Or is prayer a way to align yourself with God's will so that things that already were going to happen according to his will? I want to explore both of these, these ways that people approach prayer, because I think it has to be one or the other. When Christians are praying, aside from when you're just praying to kind of receive comfort or to vent or to express yourself, I understand that there are those times too when people are just praying because they're just sad or they're just having a bad day and they just want to talk to God. I get that. But when we're talking specifically about praying for things to happen, when you say that prayer works, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you can move mountains. So let's talk about prayer. Let's talk about if prayer can work. Does prayer work? And how can it work within the Christian worldview? So let's start by kind of defining this God. Okay, so we're working within this idea that God is all powerful. He is all knowing. He has a will and his will always prevails. These are biblical concepts. These are common Christian concepts. Now let's kind of lay out those terms. Omnipotence is, being all powerful. You have all the power in the universe. You are omni-powerful. Omniscience, or omniscience. I don't like to say omniscience. People make fun of me for that. I don't know why. It just makes more sense for me to say omniscience. I guess I say it the British way, I think. But omniscience is all knowing. God knows everything. He knows everything that can be known. Everything in the known. He knows the past, the future, all things. And we know that God knows the future, or at least that's what the Bible claims, because it makes prophecy. It says what's going to happen in the future. If you are a fundamentalist or evangelical, which is kind of the bubble that we work with here, that we work within, if you are within that circle, then you believe that Revelation is some sort of prophecy about the end times and what's going to happen, and God will defeat Satan, and everybody will live forever, and all your tears will be wiped away, and all that jazz. So if we can look at the Bible and see that the Bible is, predicting the future, and God is the one, that holds the world in his palms, and he's all powerful, then he knows all, he can do all things. He is all knowing, he is all powerful. So knowing this, that the common Christian belief is that God is all powerful, that he is all knowing, and he has a plan and a will, and it always prevails. How could you request something of God that he wasn't already planning on doing? People will ask God to heal their ailments. People will ask God to, help their financial struggles. People will ask God to help them get a job. So they're making a request. They want something to happen. But in God's world, he already knows what's going to happen, and he's already planned what's going to happen. And if he was going to deviate from that plan, then he would already know that he was going to deviate from that plan, and that would have already been his plan from the get-go, right? Like that makes sense. He would already know that you were going to request something, and he's going to make that thing happen. So then that would already be a part of his plan in the first place. So by asking him, what are you doing? What is the goal? Because I think most people think the goal is to get God to change his mind or to do something he wouldn't have already done. You wouldn't be praying and asking God to do something if you didn't think if you thought he was already going to do it. If you thought God's going to give me that job, well, then you don't need to ask him to give you that job because God's already going to give you that job. So if you're asking him, then in a sense, you think, oh, I might not get this job, but if I pray really hard, God might give me this job. which that's loaded in itself. But it doesn't make sense to me that within this worldview that God already knows all and plans all, his will always prevails, that you would request something of God. Because do you really think you're going to get God to change his mind? Do you think you'll be able to get him to do something he wouldn't have already done or wasn't already planning on doing? And he might be already planning on not giving you that job. Your prayer isn't going to change that. And if it is going to change that, well, then that just really kind of shatters this idea that God has a will, God has a plan, God has a purpose that he's enacting, and that God knows what's going to happen. Because if you can surprise God with a request, then God didn't know it was coming, and God is not omniscient. Now, some people in a really wild theology would say, well, God chooses not to know. I just don't know why he would do that. That kind of seems like he's just playing a game. And I don't really buy that one. I don't even know that that's backed up biblically. I think some people just have to use that to justify, kind of make it make sense to them. And I get it. But I don't think that that's the case biblically. I think according to the Bible, God, his will always prevails. And he has a will, he has a plan, and this is what's going to happen regardless. So when you consider that, when you kind of get to that point, you're like, oh yeah, because I got to that point in my Christian journey. I remember I got to a point when I really kind of got introduced to Calvinism, when I realized, oh, like I can't really surprise God. I can't ask God anything he didn't already know I was going to ask, or, I can't ask him to do something he wasn't already planning on doing. So what is the point of prayer? I got to that point. I'm like, wait a minute. I've been like praying wrong this whole time. I've been asking God all these things. I'm not supposed to do that, because what's going to happen is going to happen. It's all in God's hands. So I guess when I pray, I just have to pray to align myself with God's will. And that's what, pastors would tell me. That's what, the Bible studies would tell me. When I looked this up online, and I think that's in line with Jesus. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So I think that's kind of exactly what Jesus was preaching, was like, just pray to align yourself with God's will. But Jesus also said, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you will move mountains, which to me is like, if you pray for something and you have enough faith, then you can make it happen. So those are kind of like contradictory ideas between the words of Jesus, which I'm not surprised, because Jesus contradicted himself a lot, and maybe he never contradicted himself, and the people that wrote about him are contradicting him, but we won't get into that today. But when you get to that point where you realize, oh, I'm just praying to align myself with God's will, you can kind of make it make sense that way. Then you pray and you say, well, God, your will be done. I want this job, but if you don't want me to have this job, then, I just want your will to be done. And then at that point, it's like, well, what's the point? Like, even then, even when you're praying to align yourself with God's will, I feel like you're still in that first category of making a request of God of something that he wouldn't have already done. You're asking him to align you with God's will, to put you in a place where you are aligned, to come into your life, to guide you. Well, was he going to show you the way before? Was he planning to do that already? If so, why are you asking him? This feels so redundant. Like you're just asking him to do something he already knows he's going to do. Or you're asking him to do something he already knows he's not going to do. And then that's really pointless. So then why are you praying? Well, then it gets reduced down to, well, you just, you pray to talk to God, to be in relation with God, have a relationship with him. I get that. I get why people kind of get to that point. I get why people use prayer for that reason. But if you're using prayer to make a request, and you think that your request will get God to do something, well, it almost seems as though you think you know better than God, right? Like you could do it better. Like God has a plan, but you want this thing to happen. So you're just going to see if God will maybe like make an exception for you. Like, do you know better than God? You might. You probably do. But, I don't think that the Christian church would want you to think that way. When I think about prayer and how, people justify answered prayers versus unanswered prayers, and how it really does just come to a 50-50 toss-up, that there is no reason to believe that when you pray for something, it's more likely to happen than if you don't pray for it. I think about how people justify unanswered prayers and how they they win the argument either way. They say God answers prayers. And you say, well, there are people that pray to survive a situation, but they don't survive that situation. So God didn't answer their prayers. And they say, well, God, sometimes his answer is no. He answers prayers. If you pray, he will do it. He answers them. Prayer works. I'm telling you, prayer works. But when it doesn't, that's because God said no. But it still works. But you don't always get what you want. And God's going to do what he wants anyway. And you can pray and pray and pray. You can have all the faith in the world, and you can try to move the mountain and pray to move the mountain. But if God doesn't want you to move the mountain, he's going to say no. But prayer works. After a while, you start to realize that maybe prayer doesn't work. Maybe they just really want to believe that it works, and they're willing to enact their cognitive dissonance. They're willing to kind of live in that cognitive dissonance where they can recognize that people who don't pray have good things happen to them all the time. People who do pray have bad things happen to them all the time. And it really is just life. And it has nothing to do with if people are coming together to pray. You know, it says, what does the Bible say? If the people gather together and pray in my name, let me look it up. 2 Chronicles 7:14, if my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves, pray, and seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear them from heaven, and I will heal their land. That is a promise broken by God over and over and over again. And what happens is when people see this and they humble themselves, they submit to God, they pray to God, they beg him to heal their sick and dying child, and then their sick child dies and isn't healed. It's going to go back to, oh, well, maybe I wasn't humble enough. Maybe I didn't pray enough. I mean, this says, if you humble yourselves, if you seek my face, you turn from your wicked ways, well, it was probably my sin. The Bible says that as long as I do those things, God will hear me and he will heal. He will answer my prayers. But I prayed and I had faith and I begged God and I humbled myself and I was not wicked. I was not doing bad things. I was caring for my sick and dying child, but my child still died. Maybe it's me. Maybe I did something wrong. And I know that people feel that way. I bet there are a lot more people than we even realize that go through that mental struggle because we're told so often that if God says no or God is ignoring our prayers, that it could be sin. It could be something blocking us from receiving God's grace and his mercy and his blessings. So we need to figure out what we're doing. What sin? What are we doing so wrong that God is saying no to our prayers? What are you doing wrong? It's always you. It's your problem because God always answers prayers and prayers work until they don't. I haven't prayed in a very long time and I feel a lot better talking to myself than I do trying to pray to some deity. And a lot of people find comfort in prayer and peace in prayer. And I do not discount that at all. I really don't. But when you're telling me that prayer works, you're telling me that you prayed for something to happen and God let it happen. God gave you that job while he didn't heal someone's sick child. That does not feel like something you should be bragging about. It doesn't feel like something you should be boastful of. It feels like someone who at least recognized that they are blessed and privileged by God, but has absolutely no empathy or concern for people who are not blessed by God. They still think they're living in a fair system where they get rewarded and other people don't. But, that's just the way God wants it. But God blessed them. God gave them the job. God gave them the raise. God gave them the big, beautiful house and the boat and the kids and, the perfect life. God blessed them with all of those things because they prayed. But someone who has cared for their child for their whole life and works, 2 jobs and can barely afford rent and can barely afford the medication for their child and prays and begs for God to just heal their child, they don't get their prayers answered. And it's kind of a slap in the face to those people when people who are very privileged, people who grow up wealthy or come into wealth, or, just come from a very privileged position and are not blessed, but just very lucky in life, to attribute that to God and God's blessings because you were humble enough, because you prayed enough, because you were godly enough and righteous enough, and God answers prayers and prayer works. It's so out of touch. It's so in bad taste. And everyone who I know that has ever talked about being blessed and how God answers their prayers, they are some of the most privileged people that I know. And they don't recognize that it's privilege. They mistake it for blessings. And I'm sure that feels really nice to think that God has blessed you so much. But I got to a point when I couldn't just think about myself. I was very privileged in a lot of ways too. And I thought that I was blessed by God. But when I realized that there are a lot of other people out there that have very strong faith, that believe in God and pray to God every day, but they don't have the kind of blessings that, others have, it really starts to look like the people who think they're praying and receiving answers are really just kind of living in privilege, and they don't recognize it. And I think it's really important people start recognizing their privilege and start considering what it's like to other people when you tell them that prayer works and all you have to do is pray and prayer works. But when it doesn't for other people, well, God just said no. But prayer still works. Amen. Thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate all of your support. Again, if you want to follow me on TikTok, it's Christy.Burke, Instagram, Jezebel Vibes. Don't forget, I do have a merch shop, jezebelvibes.com/shop. I've been getting a lot of orders from you guys lately, so I really appreciate all your support. And I love that everybody's walking around with Jezebel Vibes t-shirts. I'd love to hear your stories. If you've gotten any mean looks in the grocery store, I'll tell the story really quick because it's kind of funny. I was in the grocery store a few months ago and I was wearing my evil, wicked, child of the devil witch shirt. And I was just kind of doing my thing. And there was this woman kind of across the aisle, and she's just like, kind of, doing this thing. And she's like looking, she's like, let me see what your shirt says. And I turn and I just kind of, like straighten it up for her. And she looks at me and she just goes, oh, cute. So I don't really know what was going through her mind, but whatever it is, she was nice about it. If you want to, support me and support this channel, or if you just want to rock one of my t-shirts, you can visit the link in the description, jezebelvibes.com/shop. I appreciate you so much for joining me and for hanging out. And yeah, I think that's it. I don't have anything else to say. Like, subscribe, comment, do the thing. That helps me out. And yeah, I'll see you next time.